Hello, and welcome to the Drone Network, the only podcast in the air and on the airwaves. I am your host, Bryce Bladen, and on this show, we document the tech, economics, and people piloting the world's largest standardized drone imagery network. Each episode, we explore how drones are reshaping industries, creating new economic opportunities, and literally changing how we see the world. On today's episode, we explore how spatial imagery from drones is actually used and consumed, and how it differs from satellite imagery. Today's guest is Ben Kovacs, Senior Product Marketing Lead at Spexi Geospatial. Ben, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Bryce.
All right, Ben, just to kick us off, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up at Spexi?
Sure. So I've spent the beginning of my career actually working within space technology and really starting as the industry was starting to focus on developing for different commercial segments. The space industry, generally speaking, has had quite a government and institutional history. And at the time I joined, there were a number of really key technological developments that actually allowed it to be much more commercial friendly. I came in at a really interesting time. Through that experience, started to understand where a number of different commercial applications were being developed for customers on Earth using space data. And through that transition, started to see a number of things change within the landscape of aerial imagery specific to drone. And when I learned it at Spexi, it really changed my perspective on what could be possible with aerial-based technology and how it could operate actually in a very similar way to what I had seen and experienced with space-based technology. And it was just a really exciting time to join a drone technology company, and here we are today.
Absolutely. So Skywatch, one of your former employers, started by commercializing space technology. What was it like working with something as relatively abstract as satellite data access? And how has that shaped about these emerging tech categories we've sort of brought up, whether that's drones or satellites or anything in between?
I think abstract is a really good word to describe satellite technology, especially to many businesses that have physical operations on Earth. The operations of satellites and other technology platforms in space is very abstract. We can't physically see or touch them once they're in operation. So a lot of it is like a mystery. It's kind of behind a curtain. We don't exactly understand everything, except when we're working with the companies that are operating all of these assets in space. In addition to that, all of the data and all of the information that is collected by all of these systems, when it's delivered back to Earth, we don't always have a sense of how it might be able to bring value to our businesses until we're actually touching it and working with it within our computer systems. And so one of the initial interesting challenges that we actually faced in the early days was even just working with setting and maintaining expectations with customers. Many customers had come to us using things like Google Maps, Google Satellite, and they were exposed to really rich, really high detailed imagery of the Earth. And there was this expectation that if I use a digital platform like Skywatch or any other platforms at the time, I might be able to get that image delivered to me within minutes, within hours, maybe within a day, etc. And at the time, most of the satellite imaging platforms were actually delivering data products that were still great, but not nearly as good as maybe what you would be otherwise exposed to. And so there was this big disconnect and this big gap between customer expectations and the reality of space infrastructure. And so there were a number of different applications that we were focused on building with customers. And you would think that maybe there'd be a long library of things you could do, but in reality, it was actually only a handful of real commercial applications that were actually successful. So big expectations management and certainly a lot of good lessons learned there in terms of ensuring you can work with customers to get what they need, but also delivering on promises that you can hold up.
There is an interesting through line between that abstractness you mentioned and even just space data and drone data. Both are capturing the Earth from above, just at very different altitudes and in very different economic scenarios. Do you see these worlds converging at all? You mentioned how there was an expectation from customers around certain data and how they had gotten it before. I'd be curious if that informed their expectations, whether it's around satellite imagery or drone imagery, or where there's any overlap between those two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the worlds are definitely converging. I mean, satellite technology has certainly continued to improve in a commercial sense, just as drone technology has continued to improve. But beyond just the technological improvements, there's been a number of operational changes too that have actually enabled a bit of a different commercial landscape and different business models that are evolving. Where I certainly see them converging is in relation to how customers today and moving forward will have more opportunities to benefit from the flexibility, like the flexible nature of working with these systems, where in the past, getting access to data was really like supply constrained. If you needed an image, if you needed data tomorrow, it was very difficult to access. But moving forward, there will be so many more opportunities. And it's because of all of these changes in systems. And suddenly what happens is the shift that takes place, really the narrative is, instead of having to rely on getting data based on operator timelines, so those operating all of these satellite, aerial systems, etc., you are in more control of getting access to the data where and when you need it. And that's a really big shift.
What are the systemic or operational changes that sort of enabled this convergence or this shift as you framed it?
I'll start first with the satellite side. Certainly with the change and growth of the commercial satellite industry, more technology, more hardware in space, cheaper access to space, it just enables platforms and more platforms to go to space that are more orientated towards commercial markets in terms of their operations and their capabilities and what they can deliver. So that certainly helps. And then from the aerial and the drone side, just what we're seeing in terms of technical innovation, and to speak to Spexi directly, the ability to operate a large drone pilot network with so many nodes in the network to be able to collect data when and where needed. Those systems actually kind of operate in a very similar fashion. So historically, drone and aerial systems haven't always been associated with the level of scale as satellite systems, but under this new operational model that Spexi is certainly bringing to the market, actually they're very similar.
All right. So help me understand the different types of data out there. There's a lot of spatial data for mapping the real world. There's satellite, there's LiDAR, there's street level, there's drones, there's biplanes. What does drone data do differently? And let's be candid, what does it do better? And maybe even what does it do worse? That's what I'm almost most interested in.
Mm-hmm. So certainly drone will provide a level of detail that is fairly unmatched as it relates to other platforms. And this is just truly due to its altitude that it's able to operate at. So in many cases, we're talking about an operating ceiling kind of between 40 to 80 meters in elevation above the ground, compared to, say, hundreds of kilometers away when we're talking about satellites or planes, right, where we're talking about thousands of feet. So you're much closer to your subject, you get better image resolution, and that just means that you're going to get access to better data, which is great for customers. Historically, one of the challenges of this has just been the fact that a drone can only collect imagery and data within a smaller footprint, which is highly relevant to its immediate site or project that it's being used, but very difficult to suddenly cover a much larger area. And this is, of course, where platforms like satellite and fixed wing planes have been able to provide large coverage. And of course, this is where we're starting to see changes now that one can rely on a distributed pilot network to give them that coverage. They get that high resolution, and then they also get the coverage that they ultimately need to monitor their operations across a state level, country level, whatever their needs might be.
Well said. It really does seem like it was traditionally, let's say, a balance of scale versus detail, and also maybe a degree of speed. The ability to get a satellite to do something is probably relative to how centralized your control over that satellite is. I need to image something from a satellite. I imagine it'll take me a lot longer to get some sort of imagery than maybe someone who directly controls it or has some sort of preference to it. And that comes with caveats. But I know a lot less about satellites than you do, so I'm going to stop talking about them. But what I do want you to do is to sort of explain these data products to me without getting too deep in the weeds. Like the number one thing I found with drone data is explaining the concept of data freshness. And that is something that when I try to explain it to my mom, I see her eyes glazing over. How do you explain this stuff? How do you even arguably sell this stuff without getting too deep in the weeds?
Certainly when it comes to imagery itself and what customers and consumers might think of imagery today, and to use the Google Maps or Google Satellite View example, being able to see imagery as is, like we would see the world with the naked eye, that's certainly the default or like de facto image product that is certainly created by many of these systems, compared to, say, other systems like LiDAR, which of course uses light detection and ranging technology, so you can do different layers of measurements, etc. I mean, each of these systems are going to operate and function slightly differently in terms of when and where and how the the data is collected. And so when we talk about things like data freshness or when an image is collected, like we're really just talking about when and where and how frequent the data might be collected. And we know that the world is always changing. And many of these systems are just designed to capture, collect, and record that change in a way that can be used for decision making by teams and by digital systems at a later point in time. So the freshness piece, what is certainly important there is to customers who need to record that change, if change is happening frequently in a particular location, having access to systems that can capture that change on a regular cadence, on a regular cadence that is relevant to their operations is incredibly important so that that change can be measured and monitored, and they can then use that information to make better decisions within their business.
I've always thought about it in terms of how maps have evolved. We originally just had one horizon, then we had latitude and longitude. Then at a certain point, we started to see, well, first of all, we mapped the entire world, and that's incredible. But then there was a sort of historical context layer to our maps, a temporal layer, as it were. And you could see how things used to be. And the thing about data freshness is the more of those temporal layers you have, the more upgraded that map is. And you start to get to a place where you can not only see minute changes over time, cracks appearing in roads, as it were, but ideally, with historical context and accurate spatial data, you can start to predict changes. You can start to see things before they happen. And that's one of the catch-22s of good spatial data is once you have a bit, you start to realize the best version would have been starting this 18 months ago or 18 years ago, ideally. And let's maybe even talk about that for a second. What does good spatial data look like? Like, what makes this imagery valuable versus worthless?
That's certainly an interesting question because historically within imaging as an industry, old or stale imagery that might have been collected months or years ago, in some cases may not be valuable to some customers, but in many cases it could be very valuable to others. And it really depends on the application at hand. And so I think this question gets answered based on whatever the needs are for the customers, and those needs are quite diverse. And being able to provide flexible options for customers to meet a variety of needs, I believe, is the way in which all of these imaging platforms can continue to remain relevant. So whether they have a large library of historical data to use or their operating capabilities are able to provide frequent updated data for what customers need, those will give them the opportunities to continue to support all of these particular applications and use cases that customers truly need.
That sounds like it's the ubiquity or the standardization of the data, the ability for somebody to take this data and basically implement it into their system or workflow and have a complete operational view versus having to whip up something bespoke. Is that accurate?
Yeah, let's even just chat on the standardization piece for a second too. Like standardization as a concept has certainly been implemented across many different imaging platforms already. So satellite, for example, all satellites, imaging satellites that are using imaging technology that we would be able to take a look at an image and say, hey, I can see a tree in a road, right? They're going to operate in what is called a sun-synchronous orbit. So they're always going to be passing the Earth at like a regular cadence. And that is actually just a standardized operating procedure when it comes to other systems and how they might operate. They have their own operating playbook, you could call it. And the ability to standardize data for each of these platforms has been important for ensuring consistent operations. When we think about drone imaging and what standardization looks like for drone imaging, like the next step and the next level for this is being able to standardize what has otherwise been like a very challenging imaging system to standardize because of all the different variations and variables. And so in order to provide not just fresh data, but also usable data that can be used for digital systems in an automated fashion, or it can be used to take a look at historical data and do good time series, change detection comparisons, etc. Standardization is a huge, important part of that.
I had Dylan Gorman on recently, and one thing he brought up is probably one of the biggest mistakes drone pilots make is when they sell their drone services, they bill themselves as drone operators versus positioning themselves as a solution through the use of their drone that they are engineering for the client. So to put this another way, instead of selling yourself as a drone operator to a real estate agency say you sell yourself as a real estate photographer who happens to use drones to do it efficiently or in a way that would matter to that agency. What I'm building up to is, as we've noted, the concept of spatial data can be a little abstract. So who's currently underserved by spatial data? Like, what's an industry or a use case that's flying under the radar that if they knew about spatial data, if they implemented it into their systems, it would be transformative or catalyze something really interesting?
Yeah, this is interesting because so much of this is just based on access, getting access to usable data. And I think the first example that comes to my mind is even just operators within our own cities. I mean, cities are such complex spaces, and oftentimes the organizations that are keeping the lights on and all of our systems functioning and all of the benefits that we experience living day to day within a city. I mean, these organizations and these teams could benefit from many applications with getting access to the spatial data. And in many cases, they already have access to sensors and other spatial data formats within their operations already. But getting access to new data, for example, highly relevant, high quality, high resolution imagery data is certainly another opportunity to help improve their operations and to make their jobs easier. So that's certainly one category that stands out. I'll name another one as well, just as another layer on top of that, and that would be the different utility operators that operate within cities. I mean, utilities are just so complex to service thousands and millions of households within cities. And these organizations are already using lots of spatial data today. But again, the access to highly relevant, high quality, high resolution imagery data is just the next step that will help make their operations more efficient. And that's certainly something that I'm personally excited to see it evolve. And I know Spexi is as well.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot about like the ambiguous nature of some of these products and rather how like the edges are changing or operations or systems are shifting. And so I'm curious, you do product marketing and the product you are working on functionally is still actively being shaped. What is the hardest part of doing that? How do you market a product that is in some ways in flux?
There are certainly a number of interesting themes to our product and to the market right now that are continuing to evolve. Historically, companies providing imagery products were really truly seen as imagery providers. Moving forward with the rise in better spatial resolution, better operating coverage, etc., the ability for imagery providers to collect and maintain a real up-to-date representation of the real world is now opening doors for a number of automated physical AI applications. And the positioning of these companies that are providing this data actually shifts from being not just an imagery provider, but effectively an essential data layer to many of these systems. And to become a data layer for the physical world, I believe, is the hallmark positioning. And this is all happening rapidly. And to be able to keep up to the developments, not just with the technology, but also what customers are expecting is certainly a interesting challenge, but a fascinating one to be involved in.
There's a lot of, or rather, there has been a lot of noise and some hype around drones and even drone data. And having seen Spexi navigate a very interesting position where basically the product introduced, it moved to base mainnet, a layer 2 blockchain. And that's in basically the crypto industry, which is an industry that can be utterly fraught with hype and all this speculation and all these other things. At the time of recording, this move to mainnet was over a month ago. As far as I can tell, everything's going great. What I am building up to is the question of not necessarily Spexi, but whether it's other drone operators, other drone data suppliers, or spatial data even. Like, where's the hype? And like, what separates a real use case from that hype?
Certainly lots of moving parts right now within the industry. What ultimately separates the hype from a real use case, of course, will be a paying customer. And that is such an anchoring theme. And I believe we will see many prototypes and many pilots for many emerging use cases continue to develop at a really rapid pace. And I believe many of them actually have legs for commercialization, and it might just take a little bit longer for those to come to fruition. But if someone was to look and to try to detect hype from a real use case, definitely look to see which customers are involved and look for really clear problem statements and really clear solution statements and just see if those line up. And I think what we'll see is a number of rapid developments of new use cases that will come up, and they'll meet that requirement. And it'll be really interesting to see them evolve.
Paying customers is a real good answer. I think that's also part of why what I talked about with Spexi's move to mainnet actually worked, is it functionally improved the payment experience for pilots versus just being a move to blockchain for X, Y, or Z for venture capital reasons even. Whereas real customers, and in this case, real suppliers too, are real good canaries in the coal mine, as it were. I want to talk about what's coming up, whether it's within the Spexi product space or within the drone industry as a whole. What's on the horizon that's got you excited, whether it's a product feature or whether it's something in the drone industry as a whole? Like, is there anything coming up that you are pumped about that you think will be transformative or interesting?
Yes, certainly levels and layers of automation as it relates to using these systems. Today, to request really high quality aerial data, in many cases, it is quite a manual process, and there is certainly some automation that's being introduced. But I'm really excited for a scenario where this drone network can be tasked not just by humans, but by other digital systems. And this is a term referred to as parametric tasking or parametric ordering. And you can imagine a world where sensors embedded in the real physical environment, when certain thresholds are reached. For example, if a river stream discharge sensor reaches a certain level for flow rate, it might indicate that a flood might be coming. And so when that sensor reaches that level, if it has connection to the internet, it can send a tasking request to an imaging network to preemptively prepare that network to collect imagery where and when it's relevant, either before, during, or after a flood event. And the ability to have a system request data parametrically rather than a human in the loop might be the difference between being able to take action for emergency response or other timely, critical related applications. And that is something I'm really excited to see roll out. And it's not far away from where we are today.
Interesting. That's very interesting. It does feel like geospatial has been about to take off for years. So with someone with as much experience as you, like, what does feel different about this space right now than 3, 4, 5 years ago? Like, how have things changed?
The feeling of change feels like this geospatial technology is becoming more and more critical to real world operations. Not to say it wasn't before, it always has been. Geospatial has always been relevant. But just the level of criticality and the integrations and the interconnectedness between real world operations and the technology, I think has just continued to increase. And as more systems are continuing to operate in a more like remote first basis, our reliance on this technology has just continued to increase. So that's, to me, I think what really just stands out the most. And I think we're seeing that in the conversations we're having with customers on a day-to-day basis. And from those that are excited about finding ways to truly integrate and rely on this technology on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. All right, 2 more questions for you, Ben. First one, who in this space, in the industry as a whole, do you think is doing a good job of communicating the value of spatial data? This could be you, this could be Spexi, this can be XYZ, but I'm curious because it's probably one of the biggest open questions I've had since diving into this space myself.
That is a good question. Generally speaking, I would say any organization that's able to visually represent their data products in action, I think is definitely doing the right thing to communicate the value. And I think this is something we certainly strive to do at Spexi. There are certainly some other organizations, I would actually say, in the utility space. So like utility innovations specific to electrical utilities, power lines, and vegetation interference that have done some fantastic work to provide highly relevant product demos to really showcase and communicate the value of their technology. And I would certainly advise people that are looking for inspiration to actually look to that industry for a few of those organizations.
All right, good answer. Did not expect it to be quite so nuanced or interesting. I was going to say Niantic Spatial if you didn't have anything. They have a video I send people when I try to explain what spatial data can do, which I think really backs up your point of as long as you can show the product somehow, remove the abstraction as it were, I do think you're miles ahead of most of the competition. But this brings me to my last and arguably most important question, Ben. Do you have 2 minutes to join me for our hit segment, Drone or Don't?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Fantastic. So how this works is pretty simple. I give you 3 quote-unquote drone facts. You tell me which 2 are true and which one is false. Or if you want to play it real fast, just tell me the lie. So, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Drone fact number 1. In 2023, a drone operated by the Kenyan Red Cross completed over 1,000 blood delivery missions to remote clinics, cutting average delivery time from several hours by road to under 40 minutes by air. Drone fact number 2. The FAA now processes more drone registrations annually than manned aircraft registrations, a milestone first crossed in 2017 and one that has widened every year since. Drone fact number 3. DJI holds more drone-related patents than any other company in the world, including Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman combined. Which 2 are true, and which one is the lie?
I believe the first 2 are true, and the third is a lie.
That is impressive. You are correct. So, the combined claim, I think, is what gives this one away. Those companies hold enormous patent portfolios, and DJI's patents are numerous, but my God, Boeing and Lockheed Martin alone have real competition in that regard. Ben, that was really good. I put a lot of spins on all of these facts. I've had Graham do this a few times, and he always blows it out of the water, so I tried to turn it up to 10, and you crushed it.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ben. I really appreciate your time and for joining me on the show. Is there anything you'd like to direct people towards at the end of this call?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, check out Spexi, take a look at what Spexi's doing, and of course, Drone as well. Continue to stay involved in ongoing innovation within the space. It's an exciting time.
All right. Thank you again, Ben, and thank you all for listening. Thanks for being a part of the Drone Network. Subscribe wherever fine podcasts are served to get a new episode every week. And remember to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. It helps a lot. Today's show was sponsored by Spexi Geospatial and Drone. Learn more about standardized drone imagery built for global scale at spexi.com. That's SPEXI.com and lairdrone.org. Thanks again for listening.